Jack Henderson had always craved silence. After years of enduring the noise and chaos of the city, he longed for a quiet place where he could finally hear himself think. So when he found a cozy suburban house nestled on the edge of an immaculate neighborhood, he didn't hesitate. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and symmetrical homes, each nearly identical, exuding a serene uniformity. As Jack unloaded his boxes and waved at the neighbors, their responses were polite, but muted. Smiles stretched tight, and their eyes held an inexplicable intensity, but no words were spoken. Children played quietly on manicured lawns without laughter, and even the dogs padded soundlessly, their barks stifled into nothingness. Jack chalked it up to the neighborhood's odd quirkiness. After all, maybe everyone was simply reserved, or perhaps this was their way of being respectful. But the silence was too deep, too deliberate. There were no sounds of lawnmowers, no humming of distant conversations, and even the wind seemed to hush as it passed through the trees. Jack's first few days were spent in this eerie quiet, where he found himself whispering to himself, trying to fill the void. One evening, he decided to introduce himself to Mrs. Caldwell, an elderly woman who lived next door. She opened the door, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic, shaking her head as soon as he said, "Hello." She raised a trembling finger to her lips and whispered, "Please, not here." Confused, Jack nodded, and she handed him a note, hastily scrawled, "Never make a sound after dark." Jack laughed nervously, thinking it a strange joke, but Mrs. Caldwell's eyes were filled with a pleading desperation that unsettled him. The sun was setting as he walked back to his house, the quiet settling in like a heavy blanket. It wasn't until later that night, when he heard a faint hum vibrating through the floorboards, that he remembered her warning. It was a low, guttural sound, almost a pulse, coming from the forest behind the neighborhood. Jack peered through the curtains, but the darkness outside seemed thicker than usual, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The next morning, Jack tried to ask around, but the neighbors wouldn't speak. Instead, they communicated through hurried, scribbled notes and meaningful glances. They seemed terrified of something, their eyes darting nervously whenever he tried to bring up the noise. That evening, he decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, Jack followed the hum into the dense forest behind his home. The air was thick and heavy, the silence pressing in on him like a physical force. He found an ancient stone well, partially hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The humming grew louder as he approached, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. When he peered inside, he saw nothing but darkness, a darkness that felt alive, watching him. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there, only the trees, their branches swaying without sound. He hurried back home, the hum still resonating in his ears. That night, the silence in his house felt oppressive, almost sentient. Every creak of the floorboards, every breath he took seemed amplified. He couldn't sleep, haunted by the feeling that something was waiting, listening. The next day, Mrs. Caldwell slipped another note into his hand. "It feeds on sound. Stay silent." Jack's mind raced, an ancient creature that fed on sound. It was absurd, but the fear in the neighbor's eyes was real. As the days passed, he began to notice other things. The neighborhood wasn't just silent, it was fearful. People moved in hushed, careful steps, and any accidental noise, a dropped plate, a child's cry, was met with wide-eyed terror. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the silence wasn't natural but enforced. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch, the hum returned, louder this time. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, resonating in his bones. He watched as the neighbors retreated indoors, locking their doors, their faces pale. He felt the ground tremble slightly, a low rumble beneath his feet. Jack's curiosity warred with his fear. He needed to know what was out there, what held this neighborhood in such a tight grip of silence. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and headed back to the well, determined to uncover the truth. Jack's steps were cautious as he ventured back into the dense forest, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The hum grew louder with each step, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from beneath the earth, setting his nerves on edge. The trees loomed around him, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers, and the silence felt thick, almost tangible. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig beneath his feet echoed in his mind, amplifying the weight of Mrs. Caldwell's warning. The well emerged from the shadows, its ancient stone walls slick with moss and decay. As he approached, the hum intensified, a deep rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Jack leaned over the edge, shining his flashlight into the inky blackness. For a moment, he saw nothing, just an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly. But then, something shifted. A shadow moved, slow and deliberate, deep within the well. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he strained to see, the hum vibrating through the soles of his feet. The shadow grew larger, more defined, until two pinpricks of light, eyes, opened in the darkness. They were luminous and otherworldly, exuding a malevolent intelligence that made his blood run cold. Jack stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. The moment the sound broke the silence, the hum changed. It became a roar, low and guttural, a deep vibration that rattled his bones. The air around him seemed to warp, and the ground trembled. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The eyes in the well were fixed on him, unblinking, and he felt an overwhelming sense of being hunted. Suddenly, the neighbors were there, emerging from the forest, like ghosts. Mrs. Caldwell stood at the front, her eyes wide with fear. She held a finger to her lips, pleading for silence, and Jack realized the entire neighborhood had followed him. They moved without sound, their expressions etched with terror. Someone handed Jack his flashlight, and he noticed their hands were shaking. Another note was thrust into his hand, hastily written. "You've woken it. We need to go. Now." Jack nodded, his mind racing, and they retreated together, moving quickly but carefully, every step measured. Back in the neighborhood, doors were locked, curtains drawn. The silence was suffocating. Jack sat in his darkened living room, his mind replaying the image of those eyes. What had he awakened? As the night deepened, the hum returned, louder and more insistent. It felt closer now, as though the creature beneath the well was no longer content to remain hidden. Jack couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed magnified, every breath a potential trigger. He finally understood the fear that hung over the neighborhood like a shroud. This wasn't just silence. It was survival. The residents lived under the constant threat of the creature's hunger, their lives a delicate balance of restraint and fear. He thought of the stories they must have, the moments when silence had been broken, the consequences they had faced. What had Mrs. Caldwell seen? What had they all endured to reach this point? Around midnight, the ground shook again, a low, rumbling quake that rattled the windows. Jack watched from his window as the neighbors emerged from their homes, moving as one toward the forest. It was a ritual, he realized, a desperate attempt to appease the creature. He followed them, staying silent, blending into the procession. They gathered around the well, forming a circle, their faces pale and drawn. Mrs. Caldwell stepped forward, holding a small, battered tin box. She opened it, revealing a collection of objects, tokens of sound, a wind-up music box, a whistle, a broken bell. She held them up one by one, the fear in her eyes growing with each offering. Jack realized these were sacrifices, small bursts of sound meant to placate the creature. But tonight, it wasn't enough. The ground trembled violently, and from the well, the hum turned into a roar. Jack felt it in his chest, a deep, vibrating hunger that seemed to reach for him. The air grew thick, the shadows around the well deepening. The creature was rising. Panic spread through the crowd, but no one dared to make a sound. They watched, helpless, as the darkness within the well began to spill over, tendrils of shadow stretching out, reaching for them. Jack felt a surge of desperation. He had to do something, anything, to stop it. He grabbed a nearby stone and hurled it into the well, the clatter echoing through the night. For a moment, the hum stopped. Silence descended, heavier than before. Then the ground split open beneath their feet, a deep, jagged crack that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the earth. Jack stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror as the darkness within the well erupted, spilling out like a living shadow. It wasn't smoke or mist, but something denser, more insidious, a sentient, writhing darkness that pulsed with malevolent energy. The hum had transformed into a roar that filled the air, vibrating through the ground and rattling the very bones of the neighborhood. Jack watched as the shadow expanded, tendrils reaching out, crawling across the forest floor like 1,000 skeletal hands. The neighbors stood frozen, their faces pale and stricken with terror, but they remained silent, their fear deeper than panic, their silence a desperate prayer. Mrs. Caldwell clutched Jack's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes conveyed everything, the terror, the helplessness, the centuries-old burden they all bore. She thrust another note into his hand, the paper shaking. It feeds on sound, but it also fears it. One voice, one scream. It's enough to draw it out, but it's also our only weapon. Jack's mind raced. The creature had been kept dormant by silence, lulled into a deep slumber. But now, awakened, its hunger was insatiable. If it fully emerged, there would be no stopping it. The neighborhood would be consumed, and perhaps the world beyond it. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had to make noise, but at what cost? The shadows were closing in, wrapping around trees, snuffing out the stars above. The air grew colder, the hum deeper, more guttural. Jack glanced at the neighbors, their eyes filled with resignation. They had lived their entire lives in silence, sacrificing joy, music, laughter, all to keep this creature contained. And now, their sacrifices had come to this moment. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes met his, and she nodded, a silent plea for courage. Jack's heart pounded. He had never felt so small, so fragile, but he couldn't let it end like this. He took a deep breath, and with a primal surge of defiance, he screamed. The sound shattered the silence, piercing through the night like a blade. The neighbors flinched, their hands flying to their ears, but the effect on the creature was immediate. The shadows recoiled, writhing as though in pain. The hum turned into a screech, a high-pitched wail that reverberated through the forest. Jack's scream was joined by others, Mrs. Caldwell, the children, the parents. One by one, they raised their voices, a cacophony of sound that tore through the silence like a storm. The creature's tendrils thrashed, the shadows unraveling, dissipating into the air. It was a battle of wills, a contest between the silence that had kept it fed and the sound that could drive it back. Jack's throat burned, his voice raw, but he didn't stop. The neighbors' screams grew louder, a desperate, unified chorus. The creature's form flickered, its eyes, those cold, glowing eyes, narrowing with fury. The ground trembled violently, the trees shaking, the air vibrating with energy. Jack felt a surge of hope. It was working. The creature was retreating, its shadows dissipating, curling back toward the well. But then, the ground beneath him cracked again, a deep fissure splitting the earth. A tendril of shadow shot out, wrapping around his ankle, pulling him toward the chasm. He struggled, clawing at the ground, but the grip was too strong. Mrs. Caldwell was there in an instant, grabbing his hand, her eyes blazing with determination. She mouthed something. "Don't stop." Jack screamed again, the sound ragged, desperate. The neighbors' voices rose to a crescendo, the air vibrating with their defiance. The creature roared, a sound of fury and pain, the shadows flickering, weakening. Jack felt the grip on his ankle loosen, the tendril retreating. With a final, ear-splitting wail, the shadows collapsed, sucked back into the well like water draining from a sink. Silence fell again, but it was different this time, less oppressive, less malevolent. The well was sealed, the ground closing over it, leaving only a faint, scorched mark where the chasm had been. The neighbors stood in stunned silence, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Mrs. Caldwell's hand trembled as she released Jack's arm, tears streaming down her face. They had won. For now. Jack looked around, the forest still and quiet. The creature had been driven back, but he knew it wasn't gone. The silence had been their prison, but also their shield. He understood now why the neighborhood had lived in fear, why they had chosen silence over freedom. It wasn't just survival, it was containment. And now, the burden was his too. Mrs. Caldwell handed him one final note, her eyes filled with sorrow. "It will return. Keep the silence. Protect them." Jack nodded, the weight of that responsibility settling over him. The neighborhood had returned to see,